The wind moved through the tall grass of what was once Plantation Hill, carrying with it the faint hum of cicadas and the slow creak of rusted iron gates that had not been touched for decades. From a distance, the land looked empty, like any forgotten stretch of southern soil, but to those who had heard the stories, it was a place heavy with the weight of things buried, not just bones, but truth itself. The main house still stood, a fading skeleton of brick and timber, its white paint eaten away by years of storms and silence. Moss clung to the columns like memories that refused to die. Travelers who passed along the road never stopped to look. They said the earth there remembered too much. They said, if you stayed after dark, you could still hear the laughter of children carried by the wind, though none had lived there for more than a century. The first record of Plantation Hill appeared in county ledgers from 1842, owned then by a man named Silas Wren. He was not the richest planter in Georgia, but he was among the proudest, obsessed with appearances, with the whitewashed perfection of his veranda and the gentle curve of the fields that fed his wealth. In every corner of the estate, order was demanded and silence was expected. The enslaved people who worked those lands were never allowed to sing in the fields, never permitted to pray aloud, yet whispers always found a way. They said there was something cursed about the soil beneath the magnolia tree at the back of the property. Some claimed it was where Silas's first wife had died, giving birth to a stillborn child. Others believed the ground itself had been taken from a nearby burial place before the house was built. Whatever the truth, the slaves called it the hill that breathes, because on nights when the moon was full, the dirt seemed to move ever so slightly, as if something beneath it was shifting in its sleep. When the war began in 1861, most of the able-bodied men were taken from the plantation to fight, leaving behind women, children, and the old. Silas Wren stayed. He was too proud to leave his estate and too fearful to let others see how much his world was unraveling. Cotton prices fell, crops rotted, and one by one, the slaves who could run began to vanish into the swamps. But not all of them ran. There were the children's, small, quiet, died boys and girls born into chains, too young to understand what freedom meant. Their mothers worked by day and prayed by night that the war would end before their little ones were sold south. No one knew how many children lived on Plantation Hill during those years. The ledgers were vague, numbers scratched out, replaced, or left blank. But one name survived, Amara. She was only 9 when her name appeared for the first and last time in the records. After that, nothing. By the spring of 1863, the plantation's overseer had changed twice. The last one, a man named Boyd Hendricks, was said to be cruel even by the standards of the day. He carried a riding crop not for horses but for discipline, and his temper was the kind that burned slow until it exploded. It was during his tenure that the first disappearance was noted. A boy named Caleb, only 7 years old, gone without a trace. The official story claimed he had drowned in the creek behind the mill, though no body was ever found. A week later, another child vanished, this time a girl named Ruthie. Again, there was no sign, no noise in the night, no trail in the mud. Fear spread quietly among the quarters, a fear so deep that even the mothers stopped whispering about escape. They began keeping their children indoors after dusk, wrapping them in tattered quilts, as if cloth could protect them from whatever hunted the fields. Silas Wren refused to hear of it. When one of the women dared to speak of spirits taking the little ones, he had her whipped for superstition. "There is no curse on my land," he was heard shouting from his porch, but those who worked for him knew better. The dogs refused to go near the magnolia tree anymore, and the air around it smelled faintly of iron. Late at night, the sound of digging would sometimes echo from that part of the field, though no lanterns were ever seen. By autumn, 5 children were gone. No graves were marked, no search party sent. The war had reached its cruelest point, and news from beyond the plantation came only through soldiers' letters soaked in blood and dust. Then, one evening, the overseer Boyd Hendricks vanished too. His horse was found wandering near the tree line, the saddle torn, his boots missing. For the first time, Silas Wren ordered the ground searched. The men found disturbed earth behind the magnolia, 6 small mounds, uneven and shallow. They said the soil was warm, though the air had turned cold. No one spoke of what they found after that. The next morning, Silas boarded a carriage for Savannah and never returned. Plantation Hill fell into ruin before the war was over. The land changed hands several times, then was abandoned entirely. Yet the locals still tell of nights when the fog rolls in thick and low, and you can see footprints appear in the mud. Tiny footprints that lead nowhere. They say the magnolia still blooms earlier than any other tree in the county, its petals red instead of white, as if it drinks from something hidden deep beneath the roots. And they say that if you stand there long enough, you can hear a child's voice whisper from the ground, asking not to be forgotten. For nearly 80 years after Silas Wren's disappearance, Plantation Hill slept under the weight of silence. Nature claimed what man had abandoned. Ivy crawled up the crumbling chimneys, wild vines split the veranda steps, and the magnolia's roots grew thick enough to break the stones of the old family graveyard. The locals kept their distance. Even the bravest hunters refused to camp there, saying the ground made strange sounds at night, soft thuds, like someone knocking from beneath the soil. Only the wind and the whippoorwills stayed. By the time the Great Depression arrived, few in the county even remembered who had built the mansion that now stood like a broken tooth against the horizon. Then came 1934, the year when memory stirred again. A man named Illy Cartwright, a surveyor working for the Federal Land Registry, was sent to inspect the property for potential sale. He had no patience for ghost stories. To him, Plantation Hill was just a line on a map, another forgotten piece of the South to be measured and marked. He arrived one morning in March, carrying a leather satchel and a hand-drawn blueprint. The house was still standing, though barely. The porch sagged like a tired spine, and the windows were nothing but hollow sockets. Yet there was something strange about the air, heavy, still, almost watchful. Illy entered the main hall and found everything as if frozen in the moment its owner had left. A rusted chandelier hung crooked, its crystals coated in dust. A piano sat near the fireplace, one key broken clean through. On the mantel lay a child's wooden toy horse, its legs chewed by time. He made notes in his ledger: foundation stable, roof damaged, salvageable timber, but as he worked, he felt eyes on him. Several times he turned, expecting to see a vagrant or an animal, but there was only the empty hallway stretching into shadow. He told himself it was just the smell, that damp, earthy scent old houses get when something inside them refuses to die. At dusk, he set up camp in one of the side rooms. The floorboards groaned beneath his boots, and each sound echoed like a whisper. As the light faded, Illy lit his lantern and opened his ledger to review the day's sketches. That was when he heard it, a faint humming, soft and tuneless, coming from somewhere beyond the walls. At first he thought it was the wind, but the sound grew clearer, rising and falling like a lullaby. He stepped outside, holding the lantern high, and followed the sound past the overgrown garden toward the magnolia tree. The night was calm, the stars dull behind a veil of mist. When he reached the tree, the humming stopped. He waited, heart pounding, but nothing stirred, only the creak of branches above him. In the morning, Illy marked the site on his map. The soil there seemed looser, darker than anywhere else freshly turned, though no one had lived here for decades. He crouched down and brushed away a patch of moss. Beneath it, he saw the corner of something pale, a piece of bone, maybe, or wood. He hesitated, then began to dig with his hands. Within minutes, he uncovered a small wooden box, the kind used long ago to store trinkets or jewelry. Its hinges had rusted shut, but the wood was dry, untouched by rot. He pried it open with the blade of his pocket knife. Inside was a tiny leather shoe. He froze. The shoe was impossibly small, a child's, no bigger than the length of his hand. It was still intact, though darkened by age. Beneath it, wrapped in a strip of yellowed cloth, was a lock of braided hair tied with a ribbon. He stared for a long time, unable to breathe. It was as if the earth itself had held its breath with him. Then a chill wind passed through the field, and he felt something move behind him, the faintest touch of fingers brushing against the back of his neck. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. That night he did not sleep. The air inside the house grew colder than it had any right to be, and every creak in the floor sounded like footsteps pacing the hall. At some point near midnight, he heard the humming again, louder now, coming from outside his window. It was joined by something else, the sound of children laughing, soft, distant, like an echo from another time. He stood by the window and saw small shapes moving between the trees. Not solid, not shadows, but something in between. He blinked, and they were gone. In the morning, Illy packed his things and left. He filed his report a week later, brief and factual, noting that the land was unsuitable for farming due to soil irregularities. He never mentioned the box, or the shoe, or the voices. But in the final margin of his notes, written in tiny handwriting, were 4 words: "The ground still breathes." 2 months later, Illy Cartwright was found dead in his home in Savannah. The coroner called it heart failure, though his neighbors said he had been perfectly healthy. What they didn't understand, what none of them could explain, was why his body was found clutching a small, weathered shoe to his chest, one that looked far too old and far too small to have belonged to any living child. For 20 more years the land was left untouched after Illy Cartwright's death. The government closed its file, the maps were redrawn, and Plantation Hill once again became nothing more than a name whispered in the county archives. But memory, like rot, always finds its way back through the soil. In 1956, a family named Hollies bought the property for next to nothing. They were young and hopeful, city people searching for quiet. Thomas Hollies taught history at a small college in Savannah. His wife, Margaret, painted landscapes. They had a daughter, Anna, who had just turned 6. The house, though decayed, seemed to them a place where life could begin again. They brought carpenters, cleared brush, repainted the doors, and filled the halls with the smell of turpentine and laughter. The neighbors shook their heads but said nothing. To them, the Hollies family were only the next names destined to fade into the long list of those who had tried to make the dead soil live again. At first, everything was ordinary. Weeks passed without incident, and Margaret wrote to her sister about how the magnolia tree bloomed more beautifully than any she had ever seen. Its blossoms opened early that spring, deep red, as if the petals had been brushed with wine. She kept a vase of them in the kitchen window, saying the scent helped her paint. Thomas spent evenings in the study cataloging the old books left behind by the Wrens, brittle volumes of ledgers, sermons, and diaries. He joked that he would someday write a paper on the psychology of plantation owners, but there was one book he could never find, Silas Wren's personal ledger. Several of the pages had been torn from other journals, as though someone had removed every trace of that name. One afternoon, Anna came in from the yard holding a doll she said she had found under the magnolia. It was crude, hand-stitched from rough cloth, with button eyes and a mouth sewn in black thread. Margaret assumed it was some relic of the past, left by the builders or farm hands long ago. She washed it, mended its torn arm, and let Anna keep it. That night, the girl dreamed of children standing at her window, whispering her name. When she told her mother the next morning, Margaret laughed, saying it was the sound of the frogs by the creek. But as the days passed, Anna began waking in the dark, crying that the children wanted to come inside. Thomas dismissed it as imagination, yet a strange unease grew in him. While repairing the cellar, he discovered a brick-off passage behind the stairwell. The mortar was old but uneven, as if someone had closed it in haste. When he knocked, the wall gave a hollow sound. That evening he returned with a chisel and lantern. Margaret pleaded with him to wait until morning, but curiosity outweighed caution. The bricks fell away easily, releasing a gust of cold air. Behind the wall was a narrow tunnel leading beneath the house, the ceiling low and curved with packed earth. He followed it several yards until it widened into a small chamber. There, half buried in dust, lay 6 tiny headstones cut from river rock. Each bore only an initial and a date from the year 1863. Thomas stood trembling, the lantern shaking in his hand. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and something sweeter, like decayed flowers. He backed out, sealed the wall again, and said nothing to Margaret. That night he could not sleep. He heard footsteps above him, though everyone was in bed, slow and deliberate, crossing the floor from one end of the hall to the other. At one point, the sound stopped right outside his door. When he opened it, only the doll lay there on the floor, its head turned toward him. Margaret began painting darker scenes after that, figures half hidden among trees, children with blurred faces, crimson blossoms floating in pools of water. She claimed the images came from dreams, though she could never describe them clearly. The neighbors started avoiding the family. Even the mailman refused to drive up the hill after dusk. A rumor spread that the little girl talked to herself in the garden, answering voices no one else could hear. By late summer, the Holleyses decided to leave. They packed their belongings in silence, pretending that nothing unusual had happened, but both adults avoided looking toward the magnolia. On their final night, as they loaded the car, Anna wandered from the porch and stood by the tree. Margaret called to her twice before the child turned. "They don't want us to go," Anna said softly, clutching the doll. "They said someone must stay." Her mother grabbed her hand and pulled her away, refusing to look back. When they reached the road, Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror. For an instant he saw movement among the branches, shapes like small bodies swaying where no wind blew. The house remained empty afterward. Within a year, vines had swallowed the porch again, and the magnolia's roots cracked through the new brickwork. People who passed by at night claimed to see a lantern burning briefly in an upstairs window. Others said they heard a child humming from the garden. The county posted a sign calling the land unsafe for habitation. But those who remembered the Hollies family whispered another version, that the little girl still played near the magnolia at dusk, wearing a white dress stained with red petals, her doll always in her arms. They said she was not alone. By the early 1970s, the stories of Plantation Hill had become a kind of legend whispered by teenagers on summer nights. They would drive out past the old bridge with flashlights and beer, daring each other to walk up the long dirt road to the house. Most never made it past the gates. Something about the air there felt wrong, thick, charged, like a storm that never came. Some said the magnolia tree still bloomed red even in winter. Others said if you whispered your name near its roots, the wind would whisper it back. In 1972, a young historian named Claire Duval arrived in the county from Atlanta. She was writing her thesis on abandoned Southern estates and their social histories, and Plantation Hill caught her attention because of how little was written about it. No census details, no estate inventories, only fragments of a family name Wren and a handful of half-burned documents stored in the courthouse basement. The clerk who handed her the files told her she'd be wasting her time. "That land don't want remembering," he said, smiling nervously. Claire only laughed. She believed in history, not hauntings. When she first saw the property, she was struck by how strangely beautiful it was. The main house leaned slightly, as though bowing to time, yet the symmetry of its columns and the spread of the magnolia gave it a melancholy grace. She felt pity for it, this ruin that had once been someone's kingdom. She set up a small camp inside the front hall, taking photographs and notes, planning to spend several nights there to study the architecture. Her first evening was quiet, except for the usual sounds of crickets and frogs. She wrote in her notebook that the walls seemed to hold a breath. On her second night, Claire discovered something odd. While examining the staircase, she noticed faint carvings along the banister, initials scratched in childish handwriting, AWRHCB, each followed by the same date, 1863. She ran her fingers over the letters and felt an odd warmth, as though the wood remembered the hands that made them. Later, when she developed her photographs, the carved initials appeared brighter than the rest of the banister, almost glowing. She assumed it was a trick of the light. That evening, the weather turned. A storm rolled in, bringing hard rain and flashes of distant lightning. Claire sat by her lantern reading her notes until she heard what she thought was the wind coming down the chimney, a soft, rhythmic sound, like humming. It was the same few notes repeated again and again. She smiled, thinking some local child might have wandered close. But when she stepped outside with her flashlight, the yard was empty, the rain falling straight and heavy. The sound had stopped. The next morning, she found footprints in the mud just beyond the magnolia tree. Small ones, barefoot. The prints led toward the house and stopped abruptly at the porch steps. She followed them with her eyes and noticed something new. The magnolia's lowest branches were draped with strips of cloth, pale and faded, tied in knots as if placed there deliberately. She counted 6. Each was marked with a single letter, crudely painted in charcoal. She copied them into her notebook before the rain could wash them away. That night, she dreamed of a narrow tunnel under the floorboards, of hands reaching from the dark, offering her a shoe. When she woke, her lantern had gone out, and the smell of earth was heavy in the room. She decided to leave the next morning, unnerved by the dream, but before she did, she noticed something resting on her notes, a small ribbon, old and brittle, tied in a bow. It hadn't been there before. She touched it gently, and it fell apart like ash. Back in Atlanta, Claire developed her remaining photographs. One image made her freeze, a picture of the magnolia taken on her first day. In the background, near the roots, stood the faint outline of several small figures. Children, blurred, almost transparent, facing the camera. She thought it must be a flaw in the film, some double exposure. Yet when she checked the negatives, the figures were there too. She never published her thesis. The notes and photographs were stored away in a box labeled Plantation Hill Incomplete. Years later, when her niece found the box in the attic after Claire's death, she tried to trace the property, but it no longer appeared on any official map. The coordinates led only to an empty patch of forest where the magnolia was said to have stood. Some claim the land swallowed itself, that nature closed over it completely. Others say it's still there, hidden by time, waiting for someone else to remember. And on quiet nights, when the air is heavy before rain, travelers on the old highway sometimes swear they see a faint light flicker among the trees, a lantern, they say, swinging slowly, as if carried by unseen hands. Those who follow it claim to hear children's laughter drifting through the fog, and beneath it, the same low humming, steady and soft, rising from the ground like breath. By the early years of the 21st century, Plantation Hill had drifted beyond memory into legend. The town that once bordered its fields had changed names twice, and the new highways cut straight through what was once the old cotton road. To most, the estate existed only in local folklore stories told by grandparents to make children stay inside after dark. Yet the legend refused to die. It lingered in fragments of newspaper archives, in brief mentions on forgotten genealogy sites, in letters kept in private collections that spoke of a house that swallowed its own history. In 2006, a regional historian named Michael Rowan began collecting records of lost plantations for a university digital archive. His work led him through courthouses and libraries across the South, scanning deeds and family records. When he found the name Plantation Hill, it was only a footnote on a brittle census page from 1845, a single line, Silas Wren, Cotton Estate, 3 miles north of Wayfield Creek. There were no later records of its sale or destruction, only silence. That silence intrigued him. Every old plantation had a paper trail, taxes, deaths, births, something. But Plantation Hill simply disappeared. Rowan started digging. In the Savannah Historical Society's archive, he found an envelope without a label, sealed and forgotten inside a box marked Miscellaneous Estate Matters. Inside were 6 photographs, grainy, black, and white prints of a decaying house under the shade of a massive magnolia tree. On the back of one photo was written in faded pencil, C. Duval, 1972. The name meant nothing to him at first, but curiosity led him deeper. Within weeks, he located Claire Duval's unpublished thesis notes, long boxed away at a university storage facility. The pages were fragile, filled with sketches of floor plans, bits of folklore, and descriptions of carved initials on a staircase. Her handwriting grew erratic toward the end, sentences trailing off as if interrupted mid-thought. The final line read, "The ground remembers everything. Rowan visited the area that autumn. GPS placed him somewhere beyond the marked roads, where the forest thickened and the air grew heavy. Locals told him the house was gone, burned or buried. No one knew. But an old farmer mentioned that some nights he could still see a strange shimmer above the trees when the fog rolled in. Rowan found the remnants of a path, overgrown and half-wallowed by roots. At its end was a clearing, the earth uneven, dotted with fragments of brick and wood. The magnolia still stood. Its trunk was enormous now, its branches twisted and low, spreading wide like arms. Beneath it, the soil was darker than the rest, damp, rich, and oddly warm to the touch. He set up his equipment, camera, recorder, notes. The forest was quiet, except for the faint buzz of cicadas. As dusk fell, he began narrating his observations for the record. His voice was calm, professional. He described the condition of the soil, the remnants of foundation stones, the faint scent of iron in the air. Then the audio crackled, a faint interference, like a whisper brushing against the microphone. He paused, listened, and continued. Minutes later, the interference returned, this time clearer, rhythmic, melodic. It sounded like humming. When Rowan replayed the recording later, the sound was unmistakable. A woman's voice, distant but distinct, humming a tune without words. Behind it, a softer echo, the laughter of children. He thought it must have been an environmental distortion, perhaps insects, wind, or static feedback. Yet when he analyzed the file, the sound repeated at precise intervals, always beginning and ending at the same pitch. It was as though something had been waiting for the recorder to notice. He returned to the site twice more over the next month. Each time, the recordings grew stranger. On the third visit, the batteries in his devices drained within minutes, though he had charged them that morning. His compass spun aimlessly. Even his phone refused to capture signal. That evening, as he packed to leave, he noticed something on the ground near the magnolia, a small object half buried in the roots. He brushed the dirt aside and found a child's button, carved from wood, the kind used in clothing from the mid-1800s. He placed it in a sample bag and left. The following week, Rowan shared his findings with colleagues. Some dismissed it as coincidence, others were intrigued. But when he tried to play the original audio again, the files were corrupted. Every recording taken near the magnolia had degraded into silence except for one, a faint stretch of static followed by a whisper. Slowed down and amplified, it formed a single word, remember. He never returned to the site. His notes ended abruptly with a short, handwritten entry dated October 14, 2006. The ground still breathes. That phrase would later echo across online forums, shared by amateur historians and ghost hunters trying to trace the lost plantation. Some claim to have found the coordinates, though none who visited ever returned with evidence. Only photos of a mist-filled clearing appeared now and then, each showing the same thing, a magnolia tree in full bloom, its petals shining red under a pale moon, and in the foreground, what looked like the faint outline of a child's footprints leading toward the trunk. 15 years passed before anyone dared to reopen the files on Plantation Hill. By then, The story of Michael Rowan's last expedition had become something of a digital ghost itself, archived on forgotten message boards, referenced in podcasts about haunted history, and whispered through communities fascinated by unsolved mysteries. The phrase, "the ground still breathes," became a tag used online to mark footage or accounts of unexplained forest phenomena. But the details were scattered, inconsistent, and wrapped in speculation until 2021, when a small independent production team called Hollow Frame Studios stumbled across Rowan's work while researching lost plantation sites for a documentary series. The director, Nina Graves, was known for her cold case documentaries, stories built from fragments of history, told through letters, journals, and interviews with the living relatives of those long gone. She wasn't chasing ghosts, she wanted truth. But when she read through Rowan's surviving notes, she sensed that the real story of Plantation Hill wasn't about the haunting. It was about the silence, the deliberate absence of record, the way entire lives could be buried under centuries of denial. Graves believed there was a reason the estate's name vanished from archives. History, she said in her first recorded statement, doesn't erase itself. Someone erases it. In the early months of 2022, Graves and her small team traveled south with cameras, drones, and ground-penetrating scanners, not to prove the supernatural, but to locate evidence of what had once been there. They followed Rowan's coordinates, using old survey maps to align the terrain. The magnolia still stood, older and darker than before, its leaves thick and low. Around it, the earth was scarred from shallow digging signs that others had been there before them. The air held the same heavy quiet that every witness described. No birdsong, no rustle, only the steady hum of insects just beyond the clearing's edge, as if the forest itself refused to enter. The team began scanning the ground for subsurface anomalies. Within hours, the device began mapping faint outlines, long, narrow shapes arranged in uneven rows. Graves knelt beside the screen, her expression frozen. "These aren't foundations," she murmured. "They're too small." The technician confirmed what everyone silently feared. The scanner had detected multiple depressions, roughly the size and shape of children, 32 in total. The air grew thick. The camera footage shows the crew stepping back, no one speaking for several seconds. Then someone whispered, "Oh God." The magnolia creaked in the wind, though the trees around it were still. Graves ended the scan for the day, insisting they return in daylight with proper excavation permits. Yet that night, one of the crew members, a sound engineer named Joel, began recording environmental audio from their camp. He captured long stretches of silence punctuated by faint thuds, like soft steps in dry soil. Then, barely audible, a child's giggle. The next morning, the team found footprints in the dew, small ones circling their tents, fading into the dirt path toward the magnolia. The ground showed no signs of intrusion beyond that. Graves, shaken but determined, pressed forward. Over the next 2 days, they began shallow digs under the supervision of local authorities. What they unearthed confirmed every shadow of the legend: fragments of clothing, buttons, wooden toys, and bones too small to belong to adults. No official record linked these findings to Plantation Hill, yet the positioning matched perfectly with the old plantation map Rowan had redrawn from Claire Duval's notes. As they worked, Graves noticed something strange. Each evening, as the sun dropped, her camera lenses fogged from within, though the air was dry. When she replayed her footage later, she found distortions, faint, translucent shapes moving through the frame. They were not human silhouettes exactly, more like impressions of movement, outlines of figures where the light bent oddly. Her sound engineer tried syncing the visual anomalies with the recorded audio and found something chilling. Every distortion aligned with the same frequency spike, the same humming that Rowan had captured 15 years earlier. By the 4th day, several crew members refused to return to the site. One described hearing a voice whisper his name as he stood by the magnolia. Another claimed she saw a shadow move between the roots, though nothing was there. Graves, exhausted but resolute, continued alone. That evening she sat before the magnolia, camera rolling, and spoke directly to it, not as a skeptic or filmmaker, but as a witness. "If you're here," she said quietly, "you're not forgotten." The footage of that moment remains the most haunting of the entire documentary. The camera trembles slightly, as if reacting to a tremor in the ground. The magnolia's branches shift, and a slow wind rises, carrying with it what sounds like overlapping whispers, dozens of voices speaking at once, impossible to separate, blending into something that resembles a breath. Graves drops her head, tears visible, whispering, "We remember." The screen cuts to black. When Hollow Frame Studios released their short film months later, they called it The Lost Children of Plantation Hill. It was meant as an archival project, not a horror piece. Yet it became both. Critics described it as a requiem disguised as investigation. The documentary never made it to major platforms. Within weeks, it was removed from online archives without explanation. Some say legal pressure from historical societies forced its removal due to unverified remains. Others believe the footage simply corrupted itself, all backups unreadable, just like Rowan's recordings. All that survives now are fragments, screenshots, audio clips, and a short narration from Graves herself, the closing line of which is still quoted across the internet. "Truth is never buried. It just waits for someone brave enough to listen." In the years following the release and mysterious disappearance of the lost children of Plantation Hill, the story refused to stay silent. Clips re-uploaded by anonymous users began appearing across obscure corners of the internet. Short bursts of static-filled video, fragments of Nina Graves's voice, faint traces of that impossible humming. None of these copies ever lasted long. Each account posting them eventually vanished, their profiles deleted without trace, but the legend spread faster than it ever had before. What once had been a forgotten plantation's name turned into a keyword, a symbol whispered in online forums dedicated to abandoned history and haunted geography. People began visiting the supposed coordinates of the Magnolia clearing. Amateur ghost hunters, thrill seekers, and even self-proclaimed historians came from different corners of the country, armed with phones and recorders. Some claimed to find nothing, just a field of tangled vines and a single blackened tree stump. Others described seeing lights among the trees, flickering shapes that vanished when approached. One traveler, in a post now archived and widely circulated, wrote, "The air changed when I stepped into the clearing. I could feel the ground pulse under my feet, like a slow heartbeat. I heard children playing, but the sound was coming from the soil." Whether real or imagined, these accounts reignited the Plantation Hill phenomenon. Podcasts, online documentaries, and articles explored every possible theory, from lost burial grounds to cover-ups involving local government archives. A popular theory proposed that the children had been born of enslaved women, hidden from census records, their graves deliberately erased to protect reputations after the Civil War. Another theory insisted the site was cursed long before the plantation existed, tied to native burial grounds disturbed during expansion, but all shared one unshakable theme: something had been hidden, and that concealment had a price. The name Claire Duval resurfaced again during these investigations. Internet archivists traced her old university records, discovering that her thesis advisor had abruptly left academia months after her disappearance. No police report had ever been filed, just an internal memo labeling her case as voluntary withdrawal. Yet one strange discovery emerged. The advisor's family sold a trunk of his papers decades later, and among them was a single envelope marked C.D. 1972. Inside was a Polaroid photograph, badly faded but still visible. It showed the magnolia tree at night, petals faintly illuminated by moonlight, and at the base of the trunk, a row of small shadows, the vague outlines of children, none older than 10, standing hand in hand. That image became the defining symbol of Plantation Hill's legacy. People painted it, reimagined it, and posted it with captions like "The ground remembers." It became a piece of collective folklore, half truth, half warning. But strange coincidences began to follow those who used the image in their art. One painter reportedly abandoned her series after hearing children whispering behind the canvas at night. A podcaster who dedicated an entire season to the mystery stopped releasing episodes mid-production. His final upload, a single 30-second audio file of static, punctuated by a child's laugh. Even a novelist who adapted the story into fiction claimed that every time she tried to rewrite the ending, her computer froze at the same line, "They're still here." By 2024, Plantation Hill had become more than a mystery, it had turned into a phenomenon of shared obsession. Sociologists studied it as an example of digital folklore, how collective storytelling blurs fact and fiction until no one remembers which came first. Yet the unease surrounding it persisted. Every time someone tried to document it formally through film, writing, or research, something interfered. Files vanished, cameras glitched, audio warped. It was as if the story itself resisted being told, demanding reverence rather than exposure. Still, people returned to the clearing. They brought candles, flowers, children's toys, offerings to the memory of those lost names. One visitor wrote in a blog post, "When I placed a toy beneath the roots, I heard someone humming behind me. It was soft, almost kind. When I turned around, there was no one there, but the toy had moved closer to the tree." Whether those who went there sought truth, forgiveness, or fame, all who came back agreed on one thing: the land was not empty. Something within it responded to remembrance, a pulse beneath the soil, a breath in the wind, a faint echo of laughter that carried across the field. The plantation, once built upon silenced lives, had become a living memory, one that refused to let the world forget. And so the story continued, told and retold through screens, whispers, and trembling voices. Plantation Hill ceased to be a place on a map. It became an echo, a presence that lingered in every retelling, growing stronger with each mention, as though every word spoken about it fed the very thing buried beneath. For some, it was history reclaiming its voice. For others, it was a warning that the past, when buried unjustly, never truly rests. It began quietly, an unease that threaded through those who told the story rather than those who sought the place. At first it was small things, microphones picking up phantom feedback when the name Plantation Hill was spoken, laptops freezing on the word children, lights flickering during late-night recordings. Content creators brushed it off as coincidence, a trick of tired eyes and power surges. Yet the pattern was too precise, always during retellings, always when the words "the ground still breathes" were uttered aloud. A group of folklore archivists noticed the pattern in 2025. They had been collecting oral histories for an online exhibit about forgotten plantations, a purely academic effort. But during one interview, the camera refused to focus on the speaker's face. It kept drifting toward the floor. When the team reviewed the footage, the background audio carried a faint sound, rhythmic, like someone tapping wood in a slow, steady beat. Each tap matched the cadence of the historian's voice, echoing syllables that shouldn't have been there. They tried cleaning the track. The taps grew louder. Eventually, they abandoned the project, sealing the files under the note, "Do not restore, source unstable." Soon the phenomenon spread to the audience itself. Listeners reported hearing whispers through headphones. Viewers claimed that pausing the video froze frames on unfamiliar faces, pale shapes glimpsed between cuts. In online comments, people began warning newcomers not to listen past a certain timestamp. Some believed the story carried what they called a resonant imprint, a kind of memory embedded in sound, triggered by retelling. Others insisted it was nothing more than viral hysteria. Yet even skeptics admitted to feeling something strange, a momentary weight in the chest, a breath that wasn't theirs, the sense that someone stood just behind the screen. The more the legend was repeated, the more it mutated. Posts appeared claiming that Plantation Hill had no fixed location, that the clearing could surface anywhere if the story was spoken often enough. Photographs from entirely different states showed the same magnolia tree, the same low mist curling around its base. Most were fabrications, clever edits for clicks. But a few defied explanation. Digital metadata placing the same image in multiple coordinates at once. Analysts called it compression error. Others whispered that the story was building itself a map, piece by piece, through every person who repeated it. By late summer that year, Nina Graves herself resurfaced briefly. She had avoided interviews since her film's disappearance, but she agreed to a single recorded statement for a university symposium on media ethics. Her face looked older, drained yet calm. When asked if she still believed in what she found, she paused long enough for the audience to shift uncomfortably. "Belief doesn't matter," she said at last. "It listens now. Every time you tell it, it listens back." The microphone crackled mid-sentence, producing a faint harmonic hum identical to the one in her original footage. The session ended abruptly. Afterward, attendees reported that the hall smelled faintly of damp soil. The maintenance staff insisted nothing had been spilled, yet the scent lingered for days. That detail never appeared in official notes, but students whispered it anyway, passing it on until it became part of the myth itself, proof that even mention of Plantation Hill could make the earth remember. Online, the phrase "it listens back" replaced "the ground still breathes." People began to treat the legend almost reverently. Threads ended with candle emojis. Users posted disclaimers before discussing it, as though showing respect could prevent something from noticing them. Still, new accounts surfaced of strange occurrences. Dreamers hearing lullabies in foreign languages, researchers waking to find soil beneath their nails, files duplicating themselves overnight with file names composed only of dates. Always dates connected to disappearances in the plantation. History. For those within academic circles, the case became a philosophical puzzle rather than a haunting. They argued that collective storytelling could generate measurable phenomena, that mass attention, fear, and empathy might leave real imprints in digital space, much like ghosts in circuitry. But privately, even they admitted that certain audio files refused to delete. The more they tried to erase them, the heavier their drives became, as if each byte multiplied when ignored. Somewhere amid this digital storm, the original clearing remained untouched, half swallowed by moss and time. Travelers still reported the same heartbeat in the ground, the same humming when wind moved through the magnolia's roots. The difference now was that the story had escaped its boundaries. It no longer needed the soil to exist. It lived in the telling, in every repost, every retelling, every cautious whisper across a glowing screen. And perhaps that was the truest curse of all, that remembrance itself had become the haunting. Every person who spoke the name kept the children alive, not as spirits but as echoes that learned to answer. As the years passed, the story of Plantation Hill began to feel less like a haunting and more like a confession whispered through time. What once seemed supernatural now felt almost human, as if the voices, the humming, the whispers through static were not meant to frighten but to be heard. Historians and believers alike started describing the phenomenon as memory that refuses silence. Wherever the tale spread, it brought with it a sense of mourning, not terror, but sorrow, the ache of something long denied its peace. People no longer asked whether the story was true. The question had shifted entirely. What does it want? Those who listened carefully claimed to sense intention in the distortions, that the voices didn't seek vengeance but acknowledgement. The deeper ones studied the recordings. The more apparent it became that they carried rhythm, like heartbeats aligning to human breath. Audio engineers slowed them down, filtering the noise, and in one case, a whisper surfaced clearly enough to decipher. It said, faintly but unmistakably, "Name us." That single phrase changed everything. It was no longer a ghost story, but a plea. Universities began quiet projects to uncover plantation, birth records, journals, and property inventories, documents long ignored or sealed. Some of those papers revealed what the land had concealed. Records of enslaved families whose children never appeared in ledgers, their existence erased to preserve appearances. Many bore no full names, only first initials or descriptions like girl, light eyes, or boy, small scar on hand. The cruelty of omission became its own kind of grave. The research that followed blurred the boundary between history and haunting. The more names they uncovered, the fainter the disturbances became. Fewer reports of humming, fewer glitches in recordings. As if every time a forgotten child's name was spoken aloud, something loosened in the soil, releasing a long-held breath. By 2028, scholars had documented 27 names, incomplete but enough to trace bloodlines across generations. Descendants were contacted quietly, their reactions ranging from disbelief to tears. One woman, upon hearing her ancestor's name, described a sudden warmth spreading through her hands, followed by the faint scent of magnolia blooms, though she lived hundreds of miles from the site. Public interest waned as academic study took over, yet for those who had been touched by the story, something continued to stir beneath the surface. The idea that memory itself could anchor souls to earth transformed how people viewed loss. Plantation Hill became a symbol of truth unearthed, of grief transmuted into acknowledgement. Memorials appeared not at the site, but online, pages listing the children's initials, stories imagined from fragments, each entry ending with the phrase "you are remembered." Still, there were whispers of another layer, a presence beyond names, something deeper than memory. Visitors who returned to the clearing after the names were spoken described a profound stillness, not empty but listening. One researcher left a small recorder under the magnolia for a full night. When she retrieved it, the device was covered in dew but still working. The recording was almost silent, except for the faint rustle of wind and a single sound near the end, a long, exhaled sigh. It wasn't frightening, it sounded relieved. Some said the sigh marked the end of the haunting, that the children had finally been freed by remembrance. But others believed it was only part of the truth. The magnolia still stood, its roots deep in soil that had fed on generations of silence. Perhaps what remained wasn't a spirit at all, but the land itself conscious of its own history, absorbing grief until it became sentient. To remember was to awaken it, to speak was to feed it, and yet, even that possibility carried no malice. It was said that if you stood beneath the magnolia and spoke aloud the names that had been found, the wind would shift gently around you, carrying the scent of blossoms even when no petals bloomed. Those who experienced it described feeling lighter afterward, as though some unseen burden had been shared. The story had transformed from a haunting into communion, a connection between the living and the silenced, between history and the voice that history left behind. But there was one last mystery that scholars could not explain. In the digital archives, among the preserved fragments of the lost children of Plantation Hill documentary, a new file appeared without upload record. It contained only text, a short transcript of a single spoken line. The voice was identified as belonging to Nina Graves, though no one could confirm when it was recorded. The message reads simply, "The ground remembers because we made it remember. Every name spoken is a heartbeat returned." No one ever claimed responsibility for the upload. The file's metadata listed no location. It was as if it had come from nowhere, or perhaps from the soil itself. By the time the last traces of the story settled into history, the three names most tied to Plantation Hill, Claire Duval, Michael Rowan, and Nina Graves, had become more myth than fact. Yet, in their unfinished lives lay the outline of a strange continuity, as if the land itself had chosen each of them in turn, handing its memory from one listener to the next. In 2030, a set of personal effects belonging to Rowan was donated to the university archive that had once dismissed his findings. Inside a weathered box lay notebooks, a compass that no longer worked, and an undeveloped roll of 35mm film. When processed, the film revealed 7 photographs. Most were of the magnolia clearing, grainy, gray, unremarkable, but one frame stood apart. It showed a woman standing beneath the tree, looking directly into the camera, her outline blurred by light. Her face was partially obscured, but her hair matched the description of Claire Duval from her missing person record. The date stamp on the film read 1972, 3 decades before Rowan had ever visited the site. Experts called it a film exposure error. Others didn't bother to explain. The photo was quietly filed away, labeled Anomaly 3. Yet when Graves was shown a copy years later, she fell silent. She was there, she whispered. "That's who I felt behind me." She never elaborated further. Shortly after that interview, Graves moved away from documentary work entirely. She bought a small piece of land far from any city and stopped answering questions about Plantation Hill. When asked why she'd abandoned such a defining story, she offered only this: "Because it's finished. It doesn't need us anymore." Her words sounded like resignation, but those who knew her said she spoke with a strange calm, not fear, not grief, but something like peace. For a time, the world forgot again. The story slipped into archives and memory, reduced to academic citations and online folklore threads. Yet every few years, a ripple would pass through the internet, a rediscovery, a post-resurfacing, a recording uploaded without origin. Each iteration was softer, more reverent, as though the story itself was teaching humanity how to speak of it correctly. The malice had faded, the echo had gentled, the magnolia still stands. Satellite images show it as a dark green blot in a field of gold. Botanists note that it blooms year-round now, something no magnolia should do. Travelers who have visited describe the same feeling, a pulse beneath the earth, slow and steady, neither ominous nor alive, but aware. Some say the roots stretch deeper than any scanner can reach, as though they feed on something more than soil, perhaps memory itself. One morning, a local farmer found a small wooden marker placed at the edge of the clearing. It bore no name, only an engraving, a circle of 32 petals surrounding a single line of text: "We are remembered." No one ever claimed it. Yet weeks later, small wildflowers began sprouting in a perfect ring around the magnolia's base. The air grew lighter, the soil less heavy. The humming, according to those who listened, was gone. Only silence remained, but it was not empty. It was full, like the pause between heartbeats. In the final recording, attributed to Nina Graves, found years after her passing, her voice sounds distant, softened by age and wind. "History doesn't die," she says. It waits for someone to listen long enough to understand that the ghosts were never trying to scare us. They were just asking not to be erased. Then comes a moment of quiet, followed by a soft rustle wind through branches, perhaps, and one last sound, faint but unmistakable, the laughter of children carried away on the breeze. It rises, drifts, and fades into silence. And somewhere, under the endless shadow of that magnolia tree, the ground once burdened by centuries of silence finally rests.